You love them more. You know this. You have known it for a while, even if you have not said it in those exact words, even to yourself. You were the one who noticed when something was wrong. You were the one who remembered the details. You were the one who stayed up turning the conversation over, looking for what you might have done differently, while they slept easily in the next room, or the next city, or the next chapter of a life that did not seem to require the same accounting yours did. This is not a story about them being cruel, necessarily. Sometimes it is. Often it is simpler and sadder than that. Sometimes two people simply love at different depths, and one of them spends years not noticing or not admitting the size of the gap. You noticed. You are noticing it again right now, in this dark, which is often when these things become clearest, when the day's distractions have gone quiet, and what remains is the plain arithmetic of who reached further. Before we begin, leave one word in the comments tonight. One word for what that imbalance felt like. Tired, invisible, too much, not enough. Whatever is most honest, someone will read it and recognize themselves in it completely. If this channel is finding you something worth returning to, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. Now, close your eyes if they are ready. Tonight's stories come from 6 traditions and 9 centuries. A Chinese silk merchant's daughter who loved a man for 11 years before she finally understood the shape of what she had been giving and what she had been receiving. A Japanese poet of the Heian court who wrote 300 poems to someone who answered with 3 and found in the imbalance a different kind of love than the one she had been seeking. A Tibetan woman who crossed 2 mountain passes every season for 9 years to see a man who never once crossed one to see her, and understood, finally, what the crossing had actually been for. A Korean widow of the Goryeo period who discovered, after her husband's death, the precise weight of love she had given that had never been weighed in return, and found something unexpected in the discovery. A Burmese laywoman who spent 15 years loving a husband who was kind, but absent in the particular way that some people are absent even when they are in the room, and learned to ask a question she had never thought to ask. And a very old Vietnamese woman who, on one of the last evenings of her life, told her granddaughter the difference between the love that costs you yourself and the love that does not, a difference she had spent 60 years learning to see. These stories are contemplative in nature, offered for rest and reflection, not as medical or therapeutic advice. Simply stories, simply this. Feel where your body meets whatever is beneath it right now. You are not reaching for anyone tonight. Whatever you gave, you do not have to give it again right now. Just rest. The stories are waiting. In the city of Suzhou during the Southern Song dynasty, in the early 13th century, when the canals and gardens of that city had already developed the particular beauty that would make it celebrated across the following centuries, there was a woman named Chen Yu-ying, not the laywoman of the jar of water, but a different woman of the same name, the daughter of a prosperous silk merchant who fell in love at 19 with a young scholar named Lin, who lodged near her family's compound while studying for the imperial examinations. She loved him for 11 years. The love began the way such things began in that world, in glances across courtyard walls, in messages passed through servants who were paid for their discretion, in the specific intensity of a young woman's first attachment, formed in the constrained circumstances of a society that gave her very little room to act on it directly. He returned her affection. This was real. He was not cruel and he was not indifferent. In the early years, he wrote to her with what seemed like genuine warmth. He spoke of a future together. After the examinations, after his position was secured, after the practical matters that a young scholar without independent means needed to settle before he could properly ask for a merchant's daughter. The examinations did not go as he hoped. He failed the first time, then the second. He stayed in Suzhou, continuing to study, continuing to write to her, continuing to speak of the future that the failed examinations kept postponing. She waited. She was, by the standards of her world, patient in a way that was considered a virtue. She turned away other prospects that her family raised. She maintained the correspondence. She believed, across years that became more years, that the waiting was temporary, that the future he spoke of was simply delayed rather than absent. In the 11th year, she was 30. Her younger sister, 24, had been married for 6 years and had 2 children. Her parents had stopped raising other prospects, not because they had given up on her marrying, but because the years of waiting had made the situation awkward to address directly. Lin had passed a lower-tier examination in the 8th year and had taken a minor position in a provincial office 2 days' travel from Suzhou. He wrote less frequently after this. The letters that came were warm but shorter, occupied with the details of his new position, mentioning the future less often than he once had. She did not notice the change immediately. She had spent so many years interpreting his letters generously, finding in them the continuation of the promise he had made at 19, that the gradual thinning of that promise did not register as a change in the quality of his feeling. She attributed it to the demands of his position. She continued to wait. In the 11th year, a relative who had traveled to the province where Lin held his position returned with information that could no longer be interpreted generously. Lin had married, the previous year, the daughter of a local official whose connections would benefit his career. He had not written to tell her. He had continued sending the warm, shorter letters that mentioned the future less often, as though the correspondence with her could continue alongside a marriage he had not mentioned. She sat with this for a long time before she understood what she was sitting with. It was not only the loss of him, it was the recognition, arriving all at once after 11 years of gradual accumulation, of the actual shape of what had been happening. She had been writing letters of devotion for 11 years. He had been writing letters of warmth, which was a different and much smaller thing, and she had been reading the warmth as devotion because she needed it to be devotion, because 11 years of waiting required the waiting to mean what she needed it to mean. She had loved him more, not slightly more, substantially more, in a way that the 11 years made visible only in retrospect, the way a debt becomes visible only when it is finally totaled. She went to a Buddhist nun, who maintained a small temple near her family's compound, a woman she had known since childhood, and told her what she had discovered. The nun listened without expressing the sympathy that Chen Yuying had expected. When she finished, the nun asked a question that was not gentle in the way Chen Yuying had wanted gentleness. She asked, "What were you loving for 11 years?" Chen Yuying said, "Him." The nun said, "Were you? Or were you loving the promise he made when he was 19 and you were the same age? A promise neither of you had the wisdom yet to know whether you could keep." Chen Yuying sat with this. The nun said, "Love that is returned in equal measure is rare and should be treasured when it is found. But love that is given in vastly greater measure than it is received is not always love misdirected. Sometimes it is love practicing on a person who happens to be present, the way a musician practices scales on whatever instrument is at hand. The scales are real, the music is real, but the instrument was not the point." Chen Yuying asked, "Then what was the point?" The nun said, "You spent 11 years learning to love with your whole attention, your whole patience, your whole capacity for devotion. That capacity is real, and it is yours, regardless of what happened to the particular promise you attached it to. The question is not whether he deserved what you gave him. The question is what you will do now that you know you have this capacity, and know also that it requires a worthier place to live." This is the first thing tonight's stories offer. Not the comfort that the love was wasted, which is not quite true. The recognition that loving more than you were loved is not evidence that something is wrong with you. It may be evidence of an unusual capacity for devotion that happened to be given to someone who could not, or would not, meet it at the same depth. The capacity is not diminished by where it was placed. It is simply waiting for a better place to live. Let the chest soften now, just slightly. Whatever you have been carrying about the size of what you gave compared to what you received, let it rest tonight. Not resolved, just rested. And as Chen Yuying sits with the nun in the small temple near her family's compound in Suzhou and begins to understand the 11 years differently, we travel now eastward to Japan, where a poet wrote 300 poems to someone who answered with 3. In the imperial court of Kyoto during the Heian period, in the late 10th century, when the exchange of poetry was the primary medium through which courtiers conducted their romantic lives, when a person's feelings were properly expressed, not in direct speech but in the careful composition of verse, sent through intermediaries, and received with equal care, there was a court lady named Eshun. Not the walking nun of the loneliness story, but a different woman who served in the household of a senior consort and who fell in love, in her 23rd year, with a courtier of middling rank named Fujiwara no Yorimichi. The convention of that court required that affection be expressed through poems, and that the quality and frequency of the poems exchanged constituted the visible record of a relationship's depth. A serious courtship was conducted through a sustained correspondence of verse, each poem responding to the last, building across months or years a shared text that the participants and, often, the wider court could read as evidence of the relationship's seriousness. Eshun wrote poems with the specific intensity of someone for whom poetry was not simply convention, but genuine expression. She had a gift for it, recognized even by those who did not share her feelings for Yorimichi, a capacity to find in the smallest natural images a particular quality of moonlight, the specific sound of rain on a specific evening, an exact correspondence to the interior state she was trying to convey. She wrote to him for 3 years. By her own careful count, which she kept in the way court ladies of that period sometimes kept records of their correspondence, she sent him approximately 300 poems across those 3 years. He answered with perhaps 30, and of those 30, many were short, conventional, the kind of poem a courtier sent because not answering at all would have been a more obvious slight than answering briefly. She knew this. She had been trained, as all court ladies of that period were trained, to read poetry with extreme precision, to notice the difference between a poem composed with care and a poem composed to fulfill an obligation. She could see, in his 30 replies, the difference between the handful that had been written with genuine feeling and the larger number that had been written because 3 years of silence in the face of 300 poems would have been a more visible cruelty than the brief, adequate responses he provided instead. She continued writing for the full 3 years. In the spring of the 3rd year, she learned that Yorimichi had begun a more serious correspondence with another court lady, a correspondence conducted with the frequency and intensity that hers had never received from him, the kind of correspondence that the court understood to signal a relationship moving toward formal recognition. She did not write an angry poem, though the convention permitted poems of reproach, and she would have been within her rights to compose one. She sat for several days with what she had learned. She understood, sitting with it, something about the 300 poems that she had not understood while writing them. She had believed, for 3 years, that she was writing to him, composing for an audience of one, building a shared correspondence that would eventually be recognized by both of them as the foundation of something significant. What she understood, sitting with the news of his other correspondence, was that she had been writing largely to herself. The 300 poems had been, in their deepest function, the development of her own capacity to perceive and to articulate, a practice that happened to be addressed to him, but that did not actually require his reception to be complete. The moon she described in 40 different poems across 3 years had become, through the writing, more visible to her than it had ever been before she began writing about it. The rain, the specific sounds of specific evenings, the precise quality of longing she had learned to render in increasingly exact language, all of this had happened in her, through the writing, regardless of how he had received it. She had given him 300 poems. What she had actually built, across 3 years, was the capacity itself, the developed sensitivity that the practice of writing 300 careful poems produces in a person, regardless of their reception. She wrote one final poem to Yorimichi, brief and without reproach, acknowledging the end of the correspondence with the same care she had brought to its 3 years. She continued writing poetry for the rest of her life, no longer addressed to him, addressed to whatever moved her, the seasons, the particular quality of specific mornings, the lives of those around her. Her collected poems, which survived in fragments into later centuries, are remembered not for the unequal correspondence with Yorimichi, but for the quality of perception that the years of writing to him had developed in her, a quality that outlasted him entirely and belonged, finally, only to her. She said, in a later poem reflecting on this period, something that later commentators have read as the key to understanding her work. I gave 300 poems to receive 30. What I did not understand until later was that the giving itself was the gift, not the exchange. The moon does not require my poem to be the moon, but my poem, in trying to meet the moon, became something it would not have become if the moon had answered. You may have given more than you received. The years of attention, the care, the specific quality of devotion that you brought to a person who answered with less. What that capacity built in you, the developed ability to love carefully and completely, did not require their equal participation to be real. It is yours now, regardless of where it was first practiced. Let your hands rest open now, the hands that wrote so many poems, so much attention, so much care. The poems are still real. The capacity they built is still yours. And as Eshun writes her final poem to Yorimichi, in the lamplight of the Heian court, and begins to write toward the wider world instead, we travel westward and north, to the high plateau of Tibet, where a woman crossed 2 mountain passes every season for 9 years to see a man who never once crossed one to see her. In the region of Kham in eastern Tibet, in the 15th century, there was a woman named Pema Yangchen, not the lineage holder of the exhaustion story, but a different woman of the same name. A trader's daughter from a village on the eastern side of a mountain range who fell in love at 20 with a man named Sherab from a village on the western side, separated from her by 2 high passes that took, in good weather, 3 days to cross. He had come to her village with a trading party. They had met during the week, the party stayed, and something had formed between them in that week that felt, to her, substantial enough to sustain a relationship across the considerable distance that separated their villages. He returned to his village, she began, that first season, the practice that would continue for 9 years. She crossed the 2 passes to see him, 3 days each way, timing her visits to the trading seasons when the passes were most reliably clear, staying for a week or 2 weeks in his village before crossing back. He never once crossed to her village. This was not, in the early years, something she examined closely. He had reasons, real reasons, that seemed adequate at the time. His work required his presence in his village in ways that made extended absence difficult. Her crossing, while demanding, was something she was capable of and willing to do, and in the early enthusiasm of the relationship, the willingness felt like devotion rather than imbalance. By the 5th year, the asymmetry had become a fact she could not avoid noticing, even though she continued, for 4 more years, to avoid examining what the fact meant. She crossed the passes twice a year, sometimes 3 times when the weather allowed. 9 years of crossings, accumulated, meant she had walked the equivalent of a journey many times longer than most traders in that region walked in their entire working lives. She had crossed in spring snow and autumn wind, and the specific cold of early winter when the passes were beginning to close and the crossing carried genuine risk. He had crossed nothing. Not once, in 9 years, had he made the 3-day journey to see her in the place where she lived, among the people who knew her, in the context that was hers rather than his. In the 9th year, on a crossing in late autumn, when the wind on the higher pass was strong enough that she had to stop twice to rest in the lee of rock formations, she found herself, for the first time, asking the question directly rather than around its edges. Why was she always the one who crossed? She arrived at his village, and the visit proceeded as it always proceeded, warm and genuine in its way. Sharab glad to see her, in the specific manner of someone who was glad, but had not particularly missed the absence. On the crossing back, alone, with 9 years of crossings behind her, and the question finally asked directly, she understood something about the 9 years that she had not let herself understand while she was inside them. She had been crossing not only the mountains. She had been crossing, every season, into his world, on his terms, in the configuration that was comfortable for him. He had never had to leave anything. He had never had to risk the passes. He had never had to arrive somewhere unfamiliar and be received as a guest rather than a host. The entire relationship had been conducted in the place that was his, by the rules that were his, through the effort that was entirely hers. This was not, she understood, necessarily because he was selfish or cruel. It might simply have been because the relationship cost him nothing, and therefore he had never had reason to examine what it cost her. She sat at the high camp that night, in the cold, considering 9 years of crossings. She did not return the following spring. She did not announce this dramatically. She simply did not make the crossing when the trading season opened. He sent word, eventually, through travelers, asking why. She sent back a message that was simple and not unkind. She had crossed enough mountains for one life and would like, for a season, to see what her own village looked like when she was not preparing to leave it. She never made the crossing again. She married, several years later, a man from her own village, a relationship that required, she noted with some private amusement in her later years, that they both walk the same distance to meet each other in the middle, which was no distance at all because they lived in the same place. She said, to a younger woman in the village who came to her with a similar question about a relationship that required all the crossing from her side, count the crossings. Not to keep score in anger, but to see clearly. If you are always the one walking, ask why the other person has never needed to walk. The answer will tell you something important about what the relationship actually costs each of you, regardless of what either of you has been saying about it. If you have been crossing alone, season after season, toward someone who has never once made the journey toward you, this is worth sitting with tonight. Not in anger, necessarily, in clarity. What would it mean to stop crossing, even for one season? Not forever necessarily, just to see what your own village looks like when you are not preparing to leave it. Let the legs be heavy and still now, the legs that have crossed so much. They can rest tonight. No passes to cross. Just this bed, this stillness, this place that is yours. And as Pema Yangchen sits in her own village in the years after the crossing stopped and finds something she had not expected in the staying, we travel eastward to Korea, where a widow discovered after her husband's death the precise weight of love she had given that had never been weighed in return. In the province of Gyeongsang, in the Goryeo Kingdom of Korea, in the early 13th century, there was a woman named Sojung, not the woman of the Celadon village in the earlier grief story, but a different woman of the same name, who had been married for 22 years when her husband died of an illness that took him slowly enough that she had time to nurse him, and quickly enough that the nursing did not extend across years. He had been, by the standards available to her, a good husband. He had not been cruel. He had provided for the household adequately. He had not, as some husbands of that period and place did, treated her with disrespect or abandoned his responsibilities to drink or to other women. By the measures her society offered her for evaluating a marriage, hers had been a successful one. After his death, in the process of managing his affairs and going through his belongings, she found a small box that contained letters. She had not known about the letters. They were not love letters to another woman, which was the fear that gripped her briefly before she opened the box. They were, instead, something stranger and in its way more revealing. They were her own letters to him, written across the early years of their marriage, during periods when his work had taken him away from their household for extended stretches, returned to her in this box because he had, apparently, kept every one. She had forgotten she had written most of them. Reading them now, 22 years later, she encountered a version of herself she had not thought about in decades. A young wife, writing to her absent husband with a specific quality of devotion and attention that the intervening decades of ordinary married life had worn smooth. She read through the letters across several evenings. What she noticed, reading them, was not only her own voice, but the absence of his. She had kept nothing of his to her, because he had written little, returning from his travels rather than corresponding during them, and the letters he had sent in response to hers had been brief and practical, confirming dates, mentioning the weather, rarely matching the quality of attention she had brought to her own letters. She had not noticed this imbalance at the time. She had been, in the early years of the marriage, simply glad of the correspondence, glad that he kept her letters at all, which she had understood as a sign of affection, without examining whether the keeping was matched by an equivalent giving. Sitting with the box of letters 22 years later, she understood the shape of something she had not let herself see while it was happening. She had loved, with a fullness that he had received gratefully, but had not matched. The marriage had been successful by every external measure because she had supplied, across 22 years, the quality of attention and devotion that the marriage required, while he had supplied the practical stability and the basic respect that, in their world, constituted his side of the arrangement. She sat with this for a long time, alone in the house, the box of letters open on the table. She did not feel angry, exactly. The marriage had been real, and had been, within its terms, good. He had not deceived her or withheld something he owed her. He had simply given what he had to give, which was less than what she had to give. And the marriage had functioned because she had not required the imbalance to be named. What she felt, more than anger, was a specific grief for the young woman who had written those letters with such full attention. Not grief that the love had been wrong, but grief that it had gone, for so many years, unmatched and unremarked. She went to the small temple in her village and sat with the resident nun, an old woman who had known Sojung since childhood. She described what she had found in the box. The nun listened. Then she said, "You are grieving twice, once for your husband, who was a decent man and is gone, and once for something else, which you are only now allowing yourself to see clearly. Sojung asked, "What is the second grief for?" The nun said, "For the years you spent not knowing the weight of what you were carrying. Not because the not knowing was wrong, it allowed you to carry it without resentment. But now that you know, the grief is for the carrying itself, which was real and which deserved, all those years, to be seen." She paused. "The second grief is not about him, it is about finally honoring what you gave." Sojung sat with this for the rest of her life, which continued for many more years. She did not regret the marriage. She did not retroactively poison 22 years of memory with the late discovery of the imbalance. She simply, finally, allowed herself to see the weight of what she had carried. And in the seeing, something that had been unmarked for 22 years was finally, quietly, honored. If you have given more than you received, in a relationship that ended or one that continues, there may be a grief underneath the grief you already recognize. Not grief for what happened, but grief for the years you carried something heavy without anyone, including yourself, acknowledging the weight of it. That weight deserves to be seen tonight. Not blamed on anyone, simply seen. Let the shoulders feel their actual weight now, the weight they have been carrying. Let it be acknowledged, just for this breath, by the only person who has always known exactly how heavy it was. You. And as Sojung sits with the box of letters in the quiet of her house, finally honoring the years of devotion that went unmatched, we come now to the last story, to Burma, and to a laywoman who spent 15 years loving a husband who was kind, but absent even when he was in the room. In a town in the Shan states of eastern Burma, in the early 19th century, there was a laywoman named Sultrim Palmo, not the practitioner of the earlier stories, but a Burmese woman who had been given a Tibetan name by her grandmother, who had traveled in her youth and brought back, among other things, a fondness for names from traditions other than her own. She had been married for 15 years to a man named Ong, a quiet, competent farmer who had never once raised his voice to her, never once treated her with disrespect, never once given her cause for the specific fear that some marriages of that period and place contained. He was also, in a way she had spent 15 years trying to name, absent. Not physically. He sat at their table every evening. He worked their fields every day. He attended the festivals and the temple observances with the appropriate regularity. By every visible measure, he was present in their shared life. But the presence had a quality she had come to recognize across 15 years as fundamentally different from the presence she offered him. When she spoke, she was fully turned toward him, attentive to the specific content of what he said and the specific quality of his mood. When he spoke, or more often did not speak, he occupied the same room without quite occupying the same conversation, present in body, in a way that did not extend to the deeper presence she brought to him. She had loved him, across 15 years, with the full attention of someone for whom loving was a practice she brought consistently. He had loved her, she understood gradually and without bitterness, in the way that some people love, which was real but quieter, less demonstrated, requiring of her a particular generosity in interpreting his silence as affection rather than absence. In the 15th year, she went to the market and encountered, as people in such stories often encounter, an old teacher, a laywoman who had practiced for many decades and who was known in the region for the specific directness of her observations. Sultrim Palmo described, without quite intending to, the quality of her marriage, the kindness, the absence of cruelty, the persistent sense that she was loving more fully than she was being loved, though she could not point to any specific wrong her husband had done. The old teacher listened, Then she asked a question Sultrim Palmo had never thought to ask in 15 years. She asked, "Does he know how much you love him?" Sultrim Palmo did not immediately understand the question. The old teacher said, "You have described 15 years of giving him your full attention. Has he ever been told, directly, in words, the size of what you have been giving? Or has he simply received it, the way a person receives weather, without understanding it as a gift that required acknowledgement?" Sultrim Palmo sat with this. She understood, sitting with it, that she had spent 15 years giving fully and quietly, in the specific way that some people give, expecting the giving to be received and understood without needing to be named. She had never told him, in any direct way, the quality of attention she brought to him. She had simply brought it, consistently, and had measured his response against an unstated and unexamined standard. The old teacher said, "This does not mean the imbalance is your fault, or that naming it would necessarily change him. Some people, told directly the size of what they are receiving, rise to meet it. Others do not, regardless of being told. But you do not yet know which kind of person he is, because you have never given him the information required to know." She went home and, for the first time in 15 years, told her husband directly something about the quality of her love for him, not as a complaint, but as information he had perhaps never been given. He was quiet for a long time after she spoke. Then he said something that surprised her. He had not known. He had assumed, in the way that quiet people sometimes assume, that her steadiness meant the relationship was steady on both sides, that her lack of complaint meant there was nothing requiring more from him. The marriage did not transform overnight, but something shifted, slowly, across the following years, as the unstated finally became stated, and he had, for the first time, the information required to choose differently if he wanted to. If you have been loving more fully than you have been loved, there is a question worth asking before any other question. Does the person you love know the size of what you are giving? Not assumed, not implied, actually told, in words direct enough that they cannot mistake your steadiness for a love that costs you nothing. You do not have to ask this question tonight, but it is worth carrying with you, the way Sultrim Palmo carried it after the market, until the right moment to ask it arrives. Let the throat be soft now, the throat that may have been holding words unsaid. They do not need to be spoken tonight. Just let them rest, ready, for when the time is right. In a village in the central highlands of Vietnam, in the early 20th century, there was a very old woman named Ba Tam, who was, on one of the last evenings of her life, sitting with her granddaughter on the porch of the house where she had lived for 60 years. The granddaughter was 26 and had come, that evening, carrying the specific weight of a young woman who has loved someone more than she has been loved and does not yet know what to do with the knowledge. She did not say this directly. She simply sat close to her grandmother in the way of someone seeking comfort without being able to name what kind of comfort she needed. Ba Tam looked at her for a while. Then she said, without being asked, the thing she had been planning to say to her granddaughter for some time, sensing that the moment would come and wanting to be ready for it. She said, "I want to tell you something about love before I am not here to tell you." The granddaughter waited. Ba Tam said, "There are two kinds of love that feel the same when you are inside them, but are different in what they cost you. The first kind is love that costs you yourself. You give, and somewhere in the giving, you disappear a little. You stop noticing your own needs because you have spent so long noticing theirs. You measure your worth by their response, instead of by what you know to be true about yourself. This kind of love feels, while you are inside it, exactly like devotion. It is only later, looking back, that you see how much of yourself you spent. She paused. The second kind of love also gives fully, but it does not cost you yourself. You give your full attention and your full care, and you remain, throughout the giving, completely yourself. Your worth does not rise and fall with their response. You can love someone with everything you have and still come home to yourself at the end of the day, intact. The granddaughter asked, "How do you tell the difference?" Ba Tam thought about this for a while. She said, "The first kind, you keep giving even when it costs you, hoping the costing will eventually be matched. The second kind, you give because the giving is who you are, regardless of whether it is matched, and you are equally whole, whether it is received fully, or only partially, or not at all." She looked at her granddaughter with the specific attention of someone who has learned something slowly and wants to pass it on quickly, while there is still time. "I spent the first half of my life giving the first kind," she said. "I gave so much to your grandfather in the early years that I forgot what I sounded like when I was not adjusting myself to please him. It took me a long time to understand that the love itself was not the problem. The problem was that I had let the loving become the whole of me instead of one beautiful part of a whole person who remained, underneath the loving, herself." The granddaughter asked, "And the second half?" Ba Tam smiled. "The second half," she said, "I learned to love just as fully, but as myself, giving from fullness instead of from the hope of being filled. It is not a smaller love. It is not less devoted. It is simply love that does not require you to disappear in order to give it." She took her granddaughter's hand. "If you have loved someone more than they loved you," she said, "the question is not whether to love less, it is whether you can learn to give fully while remaining, underneath the giving, entirely yourself. That is the whole of what I have learned in 84 years. Love with everything you have. But never again let the giving cost you the one thing that makes the giving possible in the first place. You." The granddaughter sat with her grandmother until the evening light was gone, holding the hand that had given, across 84 years, both kinds of love, and had learned, finally, the difference. We have traveled far tonight. To Suzhou, where a woman understood, after 11 years, that the capacity she had built through loving was hers regardless of where it had first been practiced. To the Heian court, where a poet's 300 poems built something in her that outlasted the 30 replies she received. To the Tibetan passes, where a woman finally asked why she was always the one who crossed. To a Korean house, where a widow found the weight of her own devotion, finally seen after 22 years. To a Burmese marriage, where a wife learned to ask whether her husband even knew the size of what she was giving. And to a Vietnamese porch, where a grandmother named the difference between the love that costs you yourself and the love that lets you remain whole. 6 traditions, 9 centuries, 6 different arrivals at the same understanding. You may have loved them more. This may be true, and it may be painful, and it does not mean something is wrong with you. It may mean you have a capacity for devotion that is real and valuable, and that simply found, for a while, a place that could not meet it at the same depth. That capacity is still yours. It does not disappear when the relationship that held it ends or changes. It is yours to bring, next time, to someone who can meet it, or to yourself, which is its own form of meeting. Let the names dissolve now. Chen Yu Ying, A Shun, Pema Yang Chen, So Jung, Tsul Trim Palmo, Ba Tam. What remains is what was always here. The breath, the body, the capacity to love, undiminished by where it has been given before. You are not less for having loved more than you were loved. You are someone who knows, more deeply than most, how to give. That is not the wound. That is the gift, waiting for its right place to live. If sleep is reaching for you now, let it come. You do not have to reach for anyone tonight. Just rest, whole, in this dark, exactly as you are. Good night. You loved with your whole heart. That was never the problem. Before you go, something small. I made this channel because I believe the people who love most fully deserve to hear, sometimes, that the size of their love was never the problem. If tonight gave you a little peace about something you have been carrying, I am genuinely glad. Leave one word in the comments if you feel like it. One word for what you gave that was not matched. Someone will read it and recognize themselves in it. And if the quiet Dharma is somewhere you want to return, the subscribe button is there. It costs nothing. It just means the next time a night like this one comes, this will be waiting. Good night. You loved with your whole heart. That was never the problem.